We'll go ahead and get started now. Thanks everyone for taking time on this rainy Tuesday afternoon before a board meeting for joining us on what we think is an exciting topic. We'll have to reserve judgment from everybody else on the resource allocation model. And so we are really focusing it today on the resource allocation model, not so much talking about kind of where we think we are in the budget, but really how the whole thing works from an operational perspective. Cashew is going to be our tour guide for most of the way, and then you'll be hearing from the campus budget officers. I'll be kind of filling in for the Fullerton College team, since our team will be really joining us starting tomorrow. But so Cashew, why don't you go ahead and get us started? But again, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to join us.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Fred, for that, getting us going on this. And I am going to, in a second, turn off my camera, but I did want to welcome everybody to this presentation. We'll let you know that the PowerPoint itself has been posted at the district's website. So if you go to the noccccd.edu website, it will be on the budget page. If you look in there, there's budget documents, and we'll have that there, as will the recording of the forum. So if you fall asleep or you zone out in the middle of it, or I throw too many numbers at you too quickly, the information will be on the YouTube as well as, or sorry, not the YouTube, the website, as well as the PowerPoint along with it. And as Fred mentioned, this forum is going to focus on the processes that we have. So it's the processes that we have across the state, the district, the different budget centers, and what do we do with regards to setting that process up for the budget. It's an overview of the timelines with a focus on the elements of the resource allocation model. And so this is just one piece of understanding the budget. And many of you who work with those budgets know there's a lot of elements that go into trying to understand how it is that you manage your budgets and how do you look at that. So this is an attempt to start that discussion. I will say that in the Teams meeting, we do have a Q&A open. The chat is disabled, so you can enter in questions as you go along, and we'll all try to monitor those, and we might type in a response, or we might find the answers in the presentation later, or if we don't get to it, we will put together responses for the various questions and try to publish them as well on the website. So you're welcome to put in your questions as you go, as you see them coming up. So let me start by talking about the state and district budget timeline. The budget process for the following fiscal year starts in January. So we just started it in January. And those of you who know that you're waiting for a proposed budget, it doesn't come to you until September. So we're working all the way from now until then to get the budget information together. And it starts with the governor releasing his proposed budget, or her proposed budget, whoever is a governor. And we use that proposed budget and analysis to see what we might expect for revenues in the following year. But then we also build our assumptions about our revenues and expenditures so that we can build our budget based on that information. So in addition to the state revenues that we might be getting, we'll also look at local revenues. And then for expenses, we look at what our permanent position costs will be and what our FTES targets, or our full-time equivalent student targets. What are we anticipating for the next year? What is our faculty obligation number going to look like? How many faculty or full-time faculty are we going to try to make sure we're meeting that number that we're required to have? And then what is going to happen to our extended day costs as a result of that calculation? And then we look and see what other operating allocations can be made as well. So we're doing all of that early on. So I just presented that information to CBF and DCC. So we're working on that information right now. And then while we're doing that, the governor is actually working on like reassessing his proposal. So he kind of comes up with this really great proposal early in January, and then everybody starts attacking it and telling him how he's missed their, their point. And so they're giving him feedback, and he takes all that information, all the negotiations that he gets from different groups, especially the legislature, and comes up with a May revise. So we look for that as well in May, because that could update what we're getting for California community colleges. So the May revision oftentimes is, it can be very similar to the initial proposed budget that we got in January, but like last year, it was different and to the benefit of community colleges. In other years, it was different to the loss of community colleges. So it can change. That's why we look at the proposed budget as just a really early idea of where we might start, but it's in no way a guarantee that it's going to settle when we get to May, and even then when we get to the enacted state budget. So what we do internally to keep us moving along is the bottom section here. HR will work to provide the projected costs for all budgeted permanent positions, and the budget centers will finish developing inputting their tentative budgets. Tentative budget for us is just a placeholder, except for positions. We try to do as much work as we can to make sure if new positions have been added or removed that we account for those. And if we know if there's any salary increases, for sure, we'll put those in as well. But other than that, we try to leave everything as it is and just roll it forward to start the year, because both the state and our district have a June deadline to approve a budget to start the new fiscal year. So that's kind of what happens in June. We take a tentative budget to board. And then while that's going on, we've got the tentative budget, we started the year, but now we have to close the books and settle up all the accounts. So in July, we're settling everything up. And then we take that information along with any updated expense data and new funding for the new year. We incorporate all of that into the proposed budget. And we're required to complete that in August so that we can print and publish the proposed budget in time to take the budget to the first board meeting in September. And we're required to have the approved budget done in that timeline to notify the state. So we do have sort of a way to back into that. We're waiting on the governor's information. He gives us his information somewhere in June, and we really quickly develop our budget based on that, any new assumptions we might have. So that's the big picture for the budget timeline. It's driven by information from the state and requirements from the state as well. And the governor's budget is available for anyone to look at as soon as it's released. It's on his website. It's the www.ebudget.ca.gov, and all the past budgets are there as well. And you can just pull up the year you're looking for, and as soon as it's published, it will be available. So this is 22-23, so all three components have been published. If you look for 23-24, you'll see that the proposed budget has been populated, but we're still waiting for the other two because they haven't been released as of today. And the governor himself, or that office, works with information that they're getting from lots of different places. There's analysis that comes to the governor with regards to the different components of the budget. So for community colleges, we have some groups that work with our budgets regularly. The chancellor's office for our system, school services, an organization that works with schools, K-12 and community colleges, ACBO, which is the Association of Chief Business Officials, and ACCA, which consists of community college administrators, and the Department of Finance, Legislative Analyst Office. All of them will be looking at the information and trying to provide feedback to the governor on what does or doesn't work, or what may or may not have an impact that's different than what he intended for our system. And then he also, really quickly, sorry, Fred, he also gets input from the legislature and even the public. There's a lot of people who provide information, and the Department of Finance tries to provide the governor an analysis of all the impacts of any proposed changes that might be coming through. Go ahead, Fred.
So with the slide that you're looking at, the California budget for 22-23 will have the proposed budget, the May revised, and the enacted budget. If you were to put in 23-24, that's where you'll only see the governor's January budget. So we're actually using the prior year budget information because we actually have those numbers. We are currently working on the 23-24 budget. So I just wanted to make that point. You had mentioned that information wasn't available, so I just wanted to get the years right, Keshu.
Yep, perfect. Thanks, Fred. All right, so that's the state process. Now let's talk about the district's, how it works, the district's budget process. So we also have a number of groups that receive information on the budget assumptions and also provide recommendations on certain parts of the budget as we're working through it. So you might be familiar with the different budget committees at the campus levels, like I think there's a PBC, another one with another B and another C in there. And then we at the district level have a group called CBF. So that's the Council on Budget and Facilities. And this group consists of representatives from United Faculty AdFac, CSEA, confidentials, management, as well as like personnel, such as the budget officers. And CBF receives its input from its subgroups, which also includes the budget officers group, which meets to discuss the various things that they're dealing with, and the facilities committee as well, that handles the facility side of the CBF. And then CBF will recommend actions to DCC. The District Consultation Council will then take action and recommend to the Chancellor. The Chancellor will recommend to the Board of Trustees, and if needed, can seek input from other sources as needed, wherever the Chancellor feels information should be coming from or would be relevant to whatever recommendations are being put forth. The Chancellor can seek out that information as well. And while we do all this, there are some board policies that relate to budget development and also management of the budget. And so they're in the 6,000s or 6,200s, 6,250s. And we also communicate the budget and the budget process in a variety of ways. So we do have a budget allocation handbook, which outlines our process, and it is posted on the budget page of our district website. We put on this forum annually to go over the model. We focus on communicating changes to the model that may result from evaluating its efficacy. And one of the ways that we do an evaluation of that is every year after we take the proposed budget to board, we look back at the prior year's budget and present an assessment to CBF of the prior year's resource allocation model. And we determine if any changes to the actual methodologies are needed. This year, the model did not have any revisions, so there's no changes to be communicated. So what we'll go through will seem very similar to the methodology we had used previously. And as far as linking budget with planning, those of you involved with accreditation know that we do have a standard in the ACCJC that requires that it speaks to, evaluating and improving the use of resources. So we do have the intention in the budgeting to have that link. We try to link budget and planning by discussing one-time funds and trying to develop a process for their use. And we prepare and publish the budget book, which provides information on the components of the district's overall budget. And I've mentioned a few times the district website where the budget information is. This is that website, the noccd.edu, and then this really weird / budget-documents-252. I don't know what the 252 stands for. So that's sort of the background on why do we do what we do and where does that come from. So I'm going to get into our internal allocation model and then the processes of each budget center. Each budget officer will discuss their processes a little bit on what they do once they get that information. And the details on the calculations we'll discuss here are included in the proposed budget book. So as we go through each section, I've tried to include the page numbers from the budget book so that everybody can refer back to that. And that's why we've used the 22-23 numbers, because those have been published in our proposed budget. So let's look at this. Our internal resource allocation model, I often call it the RAM, focuses on ongoing operations in the general fund. The assumptions that you see here that were used to build the budget, the assumptions that are used to build the budget are those that we expect to have recur every year. But what you see here are the guiding principles that we started with. So we had a resource allocation work group. We started by developing these guiding principles underlying the model, and we submitted those to CBF, DCC, and to the board to get an okay on saying we want a new resource allocation model. This is the 3rd year of implementation, I think. And so it's very new. We wanted to make sure we understood and everybody was in agreement on the basis of it because it was going to drive all of our future conversations for quite a while. So once we got that as the underlying principles for our model, we looked at how we wanted the calculations to function. So our resource allocation model is actually a revenue-driven model, and it started by developing the idea of budget centers. So we have 4 budget centers, but we start with 3. It allocates all the revenues to the educational centers, so that's Cypress, Fullerton, and NOCE. And then we provide an allocation from these 3 sources over to district services to fund a 4th budget center. And then all 4 of those budget centers participate in funding any district-wide costs. So anything that's been a shared identified cost, such as like retiree benefits, our audit costs, our insurance, there's some shared district-wide information technology costs. Those are all equally participated. Each of these budget centers in a ratio participates in covering those costs. And then each budget center gets to look at the remainder of their allocations as available funds to cover their personnel and other operating costs. And so this is, again, sort of an overview of that. This is the revenue allocation model. It incorporates these components of revenue and these components of expenses. So I'll do an overview of it, and we'll get into some of those components as well. This is a summary of our 22-23 resource allocation model. So if you look in the budget book on page 50 and 51, you'll see this information. It may be a slightly different structure, but I tried to summarize it here. The total estimated revenue that we had for 22-23 was $236.4 million. And so the model is intended to be a net zero model in terms of our structural operations. However, as you can see, we actually expect a structural deficit for the 22-23 year because of, well, mostly straight out math, expenses outpace the ongoing operational revenues. So let's take a look at what is going on with revenues. Our revenues as the district that we get are primarily from the student-centered funding formula, and it's through apportionment. It also includes some other state and local funding, but 92% of our funding comes from the student-centered funding formula, and then a few other percentages for funds the state also contributes for specific purposes, and then the local revenues that we might have at each of our budget centers. So with the overwhelming amount of our ongoing operations being funded through the state apportionment, I think that we'll spend a moment talking about the student-centered funding formula and its components. So the student-centered funding formula, or the SCIF, the SCFF, is comprised of three main components. One is based on FTES and is called the base allocation, and it makes up 70% of the formula. Another component is based on the population of students that we serve and the additional effort it takes to help these students. So this is referred to as the supplemental allocation, and it's 20% of the formula. And the last piece looks at the completion of certain educational goals by our students, and that student success allocation is the final 10% of the formula. And each of these components also uses various metrics and various rates to go along with it. So let's look at the first piece. First, there's the base allocation, the 70% FTES base. Brad, did you have something to add?
No.
Oh, okay. So there's the base allocation, and that is comprised of two parts. One is the basic allocation, which is an allocation that's provided to each college and center. It's based on its student population. And then there are specific calculations and allocations based on the different students, like the FTES that you get from credit, non-credit, and CDCP, which is I think it's the career development college preparation classes that we put on. And so you can see already just from this first piece, it's already complex, right? You've got a basic allocation, and here's where you get that number from. And here's the FTS allocation, and it's got a 3-year average here and some other counts there, and then some different rates for each of those components. So this is just the start of our calculation. And just so you know, if you are interested in looking at this information on the Chancellor's website, you can go to their website. It's the ccco.edu website referenced here. Look for budget news, and that's where they publish the information related to any of the budget components that they manage. And so in looking at this, that's the first piece. The second piece is the supplemental allocation. Again, this is the data that's used to calculate the supplemental allocation. It's the component that targets equity of access and opportunity for low-income students, so you can see the population of students that the head counts are for and where the data sources are coming from. And this is the rate that's applied to this section of the formula. And the last section, which is 10%, but has the most number of metrics included in it, is the success allocation. It's 10% of the SCIF, and it targets and incentivizes the successful outcome of our students and focuses on these 8 metrics listed here. And it even goes past like a student's time in college to where they attained a living wage past their education. The head counts are all based on prior periods, and the sources are all different, and some even come from information that we don't necessarily have ready access to, such as like the university transfer information. So for our calculations, while the student-centered funding formula is intended to fund things in a 70-20-10 split, that's not necessarily how we would lay out, but we are fairly close. We're at a 69, 19, and 11, or 12 is our ratio. So there's some opportunity to increase FTES funding in terms of a ratio that we would get closer to a 70%. And that is the biggest component of the formula itself. If you wanted to see more on the calculations of this, it's in the budget book as well. It's in on pages 187 and 188 in Appendix A. And this is a summary by campus of what the 22-23 information looks like for the SCIF. So our the majority of the SCIF, the 69%, is in the basic and base allocations together, and then the additional funding comes through as well. And so these are the metrics that each college had as a standalone, but because we're funded as a district as a whole, we have to remove any duplicated counts. And so we do a true-up adjustment to show what that number would look like to get to the total amount of money that the district as a whole earned through the student-centered funding formula. And I don't want you to forget that there are 4 budget centers. So while this is the start of the revenue allocation portion, we do take then the components of this and contribute toward funding the 4th budget center, and that sets up the district services center to allow it to operate as well. All right, so then expenditures. The RAM expenditures break out, again, mostly toward personnel. The overall RAM is comprised of 86% direct personnel costs, and that excludes any costs related to personnel in the district-wide bucket, which is like the retiree benefits. The retiree benefits expense is estimated at like 5.6 million. That's not in this personnel cost. This is what our ongoing personnel costs are. And then in addition to the expenditures, there's a few other components built into the RAM. We do have transfers that a budget center makes to supplement its own programs. So somebody might need to fund a program, and that funding may come from another source. And there also are chargebacks that are made between budget centers for costs such as custodial or utilities, campus security, and like one campus provides it for another center. And so since they benefit from it, there's a chargeback of costs between those 2 centers. So that's the overview of the resource allocation model. There are still things that we would consider with regards to what's happening with our budget, what's going on with it. We do look at and consider the impact of system-wide deficits. We also are considering, with regards to the resource allocation model, how do we address significant changes in metrics? And also, what's our RAM structural deficit look like? So as far as system-wide deficits, like when that occurs, that means that the state doesn't have sufficient revenue to fully fund the proposed community college budget. So then the shortfall in the funds that are available for the student-centered funding formula as a whole is then allocated to all schools. So everybody gets a share of the deficit, and we lose a little bit of the available revenue that could be coming to us. And then in terms of our resource allocation model, changes in metrics can also impact the way our internal allocations function. So for example, for budget purposes, we found that each campus could have differing FTES projection assumptions, and that was skewing the calculations for revenues for the RAM. So last year we had changed this so that we could minimize the impact of that kind of difference in assumptions. We implemented a 3-year average as well for the credit FTS, which is similar to the student-centered funding formula. But we still true up everything at the end of the year when the actual data is available. And then again, when we look at our RAM, we are seeing the structural deficit, and declining FTS continues to drive our ongoing structural deficit discussions. And that's a lot of what, we've been talking about. So for 22-23, when preparing the proposed budget, we estimated that the ongoing revenues from the student-centered funding formula and other state and local resources we'd be expecting to receive would be about $22.5 million less than the expected operating budgets. And for 23-24, what we see in the early preliminary budget calculations is that trend continues. So ongoing revenues are estimated to increase, but increases in the student-centered funding formula revenue rates, which are increased by COLA, are being offset by the impact of the decline in FTS that we're actually experiencing in the funding formula. And expenses for salary and benefits also increase, but then they increase by more and overtake the revenues by a greater amount than what the revenue increases. So our early estimates show that we expect to see a continued structural deficit into 23-24. But we will continue to update the calculations because the current academic year is continuing. Our FTS numbers will be updated in the P2 for the 320 and then the annual for the 320. And that'll give us a better sense of what our FTS numbers really look like. And that will change what our estimated budget numbers would look like for next year, as well as where we land for 22-23. All right, so now we do have the RAM and we do have more budget areas. So some of the other areas outside of the RAM for our calculation purposes are the hold harmless funds. And I know we've been talking about those a lot, categorical funds, carryover funds, and then all the other funds outside of the general fund. So hold harmless funds are part of the student-centered funding formula, but they were intended to help smooth the transition from the prior funding formula to the current one. And districts were guaranteed to receive their 17-18 student-centered funding formula plus COLA during the transition period. And districts could earn more if they increased FTS and other headcounts, but the hold harmless continued and continues past that initial transition. And the state's been trying to get out of the hold harmless business for a while, and we'll be phasing it out now by changing it to a floor. And so unlike the initial hold harmless, which had COLA adjustments applied to it, this new floor will have no COLA adjustments. It will be a static number. The way then to see more funding will be to earn our way above the floor. The student-centered funding formula rates will continue to increase by COLA, so that'll help a little bit, but any additional increases in FTS and other headcounts that we use will then also move us up. So if we see increases in FTS, plus the rates increase by COLA, then we'll start to see us getting closer to that floor. If we can get above the floor, we'd be starting to see the full impact of COLA. However, if our earned portion of the SCIF is not higher than the floor, we will not realize the full impact of funded COLAs on our revenues. And we did some scenarios looking at the impact of FTS and growth in FTS and COLA on the resource allocation model's ongoing structure in the 22-23 budget book. So if you go to that book and look at pages 196 to 199 in the appendix B of the book, you'll see those projections and sort of how it lays out for the next several years. All right, now in terms of other funds that are in the general fund, we have a few other areas that we look at. We do have the categorical funds or grants, restricted funds. Many of you work with many different grants that we have. You can see this year we've actually started the year with about 113.8 million in estimated budgets of grants. And this is just a piece of the list that fit on this page without getting too minuscule, but the budget book does have a larger list that we started with, and we've had new grants since then. The state has also continues to fund different programs, but you can see here the state continues to provide lots of money toward funding student success and also strong workforce, because that's really key to success for the state. And we're also finishing up with some funding related to the pandemic, which have been provided and were provided as one-time awards rather than ongoing. So like the HERF dollars and the COVID-19 block grant, specific in purpose, intended to help us navigate through the difficulties of the pandemic. As the pandemic winds down, those funds are being spent down and will not be expected to be renewed in the new year in terms of new funding.
So Cashew, can you maybe just expand a little bit on the grants? Some of them come in at the district level, some of them come in at the campus level. Just talk maybe a little bit about that.
Sure. Absolutely. Some grants, I'd probably imagine, I think EOPS and CARE is a good example of that. I think those grants come in at the campus level. So a campus allocation is made by the state, and those are based on various metrics the state receives and various program plans that the campus might submit. But other funds will come in at the district level, and the district will have a discussion, I think through chancellor staff, on how those funds will be split out by the various centers. So we would split them out between Cypress, Fullerton, and OCE, and maybe even if there is a district portion of it. And then those allocations will be made as a district-wide discussion with our internal needs in mind.
So most of the allocations are based upon student counts or FTES. Some of them could be done, for example, part-time faculty office hour dollars, et cetera, could be done on the number of part-time faculty. So it depends upon what the money is actually coming in for, that we'll try to find a mechanism that reflects kind of a fair distribution of those dollars.
Yes, and then I think that it's fair to say that there's additional discussions for some of the larger programs that have many subcomponents of activity. If a program has a lot of different departments that it needs to support within its achieving what it needs, especially like something like a student equity and achievement grant, which used to be 3 separate funding things like basic skills, I think student equity and matriculation or triple SP. It got combined into one. Well, the funding is still supporting the activities in a different way. So there's campus level allocations and discussions had for each of those programs that are not driven by a district level discussion, but they're still driven in order to align the use of the funding with the different activities that we have at the campuses.
Just one other comment on this particular page. You notice the first item up there, the HER funding. We did receive a tremendous amount over the last several years in HER funds. Most of those dollars were actually distributed to students, and we are getting to the end. We should have all of those dollars expended by the end of this year.
All right, so that's the grants, and they come in and we list them and use them and help you guys as best as possible to get through those funds. And hopefully, you know, at the end of the year, we're looking at this and we're saying this is our ending fund balance. So the grants are not really a component of this because the grants would only cover their own costs, but the ending fund balance, is the component of what we might call like our carryover funds. We started the year with 133.8 million in our ending fund balance. And again, you can see the details of this on page 81 of the budget book. Some of these funds, however, are not generally spendable. Others have been assigned to purposes like one-time funds or set aside to meet the board policy contingency. And then after all that are the funds that are unallocated. And CBF and DCC hold ongoing discussions regarding the use of the available one-time funds from this total ending fund balance. So let's take a moment and sort of get you through the components of the ending fund balance. I want to have you understand a little bit about how we get to the amount that we consider available for those allocation discussions. So let's start with this tiny little red sliver. It's our non-spendable balance. It's really small in relation to how much money we have overall. And because these are items that are either not spendable, like inventory, or they're held specifically for operating purposes. We do have a revolving account that maintains a small amount for emergency cash, and it's in there. Next is the restricted fund balance. So we have about 10.3 million in there, and it can be carried over, but can only be spent as set forth under code. So as an example, funds collected for health services or for parking fees. There's also lottery funds in here for classroom supplies. So those are restricted in nature and not available for general discussion on allocation. Actions by the board or by board policy are also not generally available for further allocation discussions. So first would be any funds that the board committed by action for a specified purpose. And we have about $6.3 million in funds specifically set aside to help the district cover the costs associated with future PERS and STIRS rate increases. We also hold an amount in reserve for contingencies per our board policy and considered by the chancellor's office as prudent minimum required reserve for economic uncertainty. And so we have about 5%, but in terms of how we started, but as part of an updated recommendation from the chancellor's office and as part of continuing to participate in an emergency conditions allowance, we took action earlier this year to increase the board policy contingency to equal to 2 months of operating expenses. So that increases our contingency from about 5% to about 17%. And we'll increase that, and you'll see that if you look in the 23-24 book when it comes out, there'll be a larger number related to our board policy contingency that aligns with that 2 months of operating expenses. Next is a group of funds that have been assigned. So assigned by the various district-wide and campus budget committees and processes. CBF and DCC allocate funds towards certain purposes, and the carryover funds at each budget center are also assigned based on each center's allocation process. And so that takes us to uncommitted funds. So we've got some uncommitted funds here. The uncommitted budget center carryovers, they're not really considered as available for general allocation because they were already earned and allocated to the budget centers. And so then if we remove that piece, which is usually not the biggest piece of the amount of money that they're assigning, we have the unallocated or uncommitted funds. So these are the truly unallocated resources. And these are the remaining funds that are discussed at DCC and CBF. And if I look at the following page, it's sort of a graphical representation. Before I move off it, I want to ask if anybody has any comments on this.
Yeah, one question that always comes up about the campus carryovers. We've kind of gone through how the allocations are made on an annual basis, but a major component of our overall program is that if the campuses don't spend all of their resources, they can carry them over. So from the district perspective, if Fullerton College or Cypress College has those carryovers, we give all of those dollars and give those back to the campuses, and they go through a redistribution process amongst themselves. But we don't sweep, or we haven't in a long time swept monies back from the budget centers if there was money left over. That's why you see quite a bit of dollars assigned or uncommitted at the budget center carryover level, is because we don't come in and sweep the monies. So you can accumulate the resources over at your each of your campuses.
Okay, and then this is the same information but in a chart, because what I wanted to show is if you stack it and you start taking off elements from the top, you can start to see that the truly unallocated funds are the green area at the base of the graph, and not the entire stack of ending fund balance that you would normally start with. And if you are looking at for more details on what makes up the ending fund balance, how are these funds allocated, the details are listed in the proposed budget book. If you start on page 81, in that section, we discuss the assignments, what's been committed, and what all the different purposes are that have been designated either by CBF or by the campuses. All right, so that's a lot. That's the overview of the state budget process and the timeline for our district-wide process. So now we're going to get into the local processes that you all may be more familiar with at each of the campuses. And I'm going to turn it over to Fred because we're going to start with Fullerton College.
I think you missed one slide.
Oh, so look, I apparently made it mobile. Oh, I did miss one. Oh, look at that. Okay, wait, I'll do this pretty. Look at this pretty thing I did. I didn't even realize I did it. Okay. I guess if I take each element away, you can start to see how less and less money is just generally available. Isn't that pretty? All right, so then the proposed budget. I did say there were a lot of other funds. You're right, Fred, I did miss that slide. This is all the other funds. So in the budget book, we do provide sections that discuss all the different other funds that come into discussion, but there's not as much that we spend in terms of effort and time on these because they are all driven by specific purposes. So our bond building funds are driven by the construction and the funds that are there. Our capital outlay funds are similar. We have childcare funds, we have retiree benefit funds, campus financial aid funds, and managed funds. Those are all things that have purposes, the childcare funds. And so they're only budgeted to that purpose. They're not as wide in terms of operations as we have for the general fund discussion. All right, now I'll turn it over to Fred.
So thank you, Cashew. For Fullerton College, and the reason why I'm doing the presentation is we have a couple vacant positions until tonight, where we will have a campus accounting manager position filled by Anita Carlos. So she's on the agenda tonight, so she'll be starting tomorrow. And Henry Wall from Cypress College will actually be the interim vice president of administrative services, technically starting tomorrow, but I think he's got something already scheduled for Wednesday over at Cypress, so he will be starting on Thursday. So Otherwise, if we would have waited a couple of days, I would have probably let Henry kind of take a stab at this one. But anyway, what I wanted to kind of really say about the Fullerton College allocation process, besides having the new accounting staff, we also have a new college president. And so we've been in discussion about changes that she would like to see to the process. So if you can go to the next slide, I'll just kind of tell you how it worked and kind of what we were looking at. The campus budget development process begins with the college executive team. I have already been going to President's Cabinet and kind of sharing with them where the budgets are and what dollars are available. We're kind of going through and starting to put together a plan. So we'll be using prior year fiscal performances, not only for this current year, but the previous year as well. We're also going through a program review process at the same time. So we'll be getting recommendations from that to see what we need to incorporate both on an ongoing and one-time basis. Also have the consideration of the technology plan and kind of what else needs to be addressed. I do think one of the specific tasks for our new campus accounting manager will be meeting with the individual departments, mostly the deans and managers, and kind of really getting more input into the budget development process. But I think what the important piece to keep in mind is that there's only a limited amount of dollars that comes through the allocation process. When I look at the amounts that are being in our model and what we're actually generating in terms of earned revenues, Fullerton College still has about an $11 million deficit. They do have backfill for the hold harmless dollars, but as we start to develop those budgets, we're going to need to start to address how we're going to address those shortfalls. So those discussions will be coming into play for the campus budget. Kind of moving to the next slide. There is a couple of committees that are very involved in the budget development process, but I will tell you, a lot of the discussions are, most of the budget is already covered by the positions you already have in place in terms of a permanent position. So not a lot of flexibility in what you can do with all of the other dollars when you start taking a look into the prior year expenditures and what you're anticipating. There are one-time dollars, especially these last several years with the hold harmless dollars exceeding the amount that we're actually spending. So a lot of the discussions, and there can be things with the one-time funding. So those are discussed at Planning and Steering Committee, as well as the President Advisory Council. And I know this last year, there was quite a bit of discussion on the dollars that were allocated from CBF and DCC, as well as state dollars coming in for getting our enrollments up. So I know that there was a significant amount of 5-year plan was actually put together. I think we had the funding for 2 years, so it's kind of gone through PBSC and for distribution. Just a quick comment on the categorical programs. I know the STEVE funding is one of the items that there's been a lot of discussion over at Fullerton College. Those will be kind of discussed, and we'll be bringing people together to kind of start to put together what the needs are, because I'm sure the needs probably exceed the amount of the budgets, and then we'll look how we'll braid funds to actually take care of the items that need to be funded for the year. So the next couple of years, I think with the hold harmless funding, we're okay, but I think it's going to, when we start doing through the budget process over at the campuses, while the program review usually asks for monies to reallocate or additional resources, I think we're going to be looking at how we're going to make significant reductions at each of the departments and divisions. So that's kind of how it works over at Fullerton College. I think there's probably something needed in terms of more communication over at Fullerton College. So while this one is more of a district-wide perspective, we'll probably look to do something similar over specifically related to Fullerton College. All right, I'm done. Guess you.
Perfect. All right. Well, and now we've got Terry, our Director of Administrative Services over at NOC, to kind of go over their process, which is going to be just a little bit different as well.
So good afternoon, everyone. So NOCE's budget process. So NOCE's institutional mission and goals are the foundation for financial planning and budget development, along with NOCE's strategic plan, district master planning priorities, and our regional adult education consortium's goals. The current and future fiscal environments at the local and state levels are also taken into consideration. So under the direction of the president, the planning process considers the need of students, available resources from multiple funding streams, which are a lot of the, categoricals, and personnel costs. So we also too have two primary shared governance committees that are tasked with making decisions on the fiscal planning and resource allocation, and they are the President's Cabinet and our Budget and Facility Planning Committee. So the Budget and Facility Planning Committee, we coordinate and approve the priority list for new classified and management positions, and then we make the recommendation to the president. And in addition, this committee reviews and approves requests for one-time funds, such as requests for instructional supplies and equipment. And then our department planning and review cycle, which is basically program review, it includes a section for resource requests. So then department leads can request for additional resources using our existing procedures. And then academic senate representatives join the NOCE executive team in determining the priority list for new faculty positions. So NOCE's current year fund, as Fred also stated, it covers basically the majority is personnel. So, but it does also cover departmental operating budgets. If there's any available funding out of the current year fund, then we reserve for personnel contingencies and other reserves as needed. But we also do have our carryover fund to use for reserves. And then throughout the year, I work with president, staff, and program managers to monitor the expenses and ensure compliance with the federal, state, and local fiscal policies and regulations.
Thanks, Terry. And now we'll hand it over to Stephen. Stephen, you can reinvent the entire Cypress College allocation process if you want to or not, but Stephen's our interim vice president over at Cypress College and going over this for the first time. So thanks for coming in and joining our presentation.
Oh, thank you, Cashew, and good afternoon, everyone. So I've broken this basically down into two components. They're really quite similar to what you've already heard from Fred about Fullerton College and Terry about NOCE. But the first is budget priorities and then our process. So our priorities start with the executive team based on the district and college strategic plans, and also considering our current fiscal climate, looking at our current expenditures, also anticipated expenditures coming ahead in the next fiscal year. We then share these priorities with our college participatory governance groups, including our group is called PBC, the Planning and Budget Committee, as well as the President's Advisory Cabinet, or PAC. Then the next slide is our budget process. So departmental submissions are based on program reviews and priorities. Those start in April after we have third quarter budget information. And so we share that with the budget managers so that they can be looking at building their fiscal year 24 budgets. The compilation and review of submissions will be with the executive team in late April, early May. And then the tentative budget will be shared with PBC and PAC in May. Then the final budget, as you heard earlier, through the process is approved by the Board of Trustees, and there's communication with campus shared governance groups in September. In addition to that, and not just building a budget, which is a planning document, There's also the ongoing management of the budget. And so each departmental budget manager is provided an opportunity to meet with myself and with two in our budget office to go over their budgets, any questions they have about expenditures and allocations. And we do that kind of check-ins right after the end of the fiscal year, beginning of the new fiscal year in August. Then again, after the first quarter in November. Again in March, as we're starting to talk about any questions about the budgets as we're getting close to the end of the fiscal year and talking about plans for the next fiscal year. And then in June, just to do any final closeout questions for the current fiscal year. We do have the operational based budget on a 2-year cycle. So if a budget manager is able to they have some money left over at the end of the fiscal year, they have access to that in the second year, which gives our budget managers some flexibility as they look at managing their resources for the benefit of their areas. And that's really our budget process as it goes.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And we'll go back to Fred for the district services allocation process.
So the way we do it over for district services, there's 5 areas that we actually build the budget for. The Chancellor's office also has the Board of Trustees as well. So what you see on the slide is the 5 areas. We're allocated 9.25% of the resource allocation model. So when the campuses have additional revenues they're generating, the district receives additional dollars. If there's reductions over at the campuses, the district services also take into consideration those same reductions since it's based on the overall RAM. So the way that we do it, we do an annual administrative review each year, and we kind of go and see what the needs are and what areas. This last year, when we put together the budget, we kind of started from scratch. Other than all of the permanent positions. So we start with all the permanent positions on all the areas, and then we've kind of went through and evaluated each and every service and contract that we were aware of and made sure there was sufficient ongoing dollars to cover those. The one that we seem to always underestimate and is part of the district-wide expenses as well is the attorney fees. And so it's one that we try to build a budget looking at what contracts we have in place, and we try to live within those. But if there's other things that come up, we do put monies aside, usually in the Chancellor or in fiscal affairs area for contingencies as other things that might need to get funded come up. And so one of the things specifically related to district services, since we do serve the entire district, some of our expenses, for example, a portion of the attorney fees, the audit and trash pickup, etc., are in the district-wide bucket. And so since we cover the entire district, our process is pretty simple. Other than making sure all of the administrative reviews are turned in, we do kind of go through, similar to the campuses, most of those are kind of focused on one-time expenditures as well. If we have monies left over, what can we fund for each one of the budget or district services areas, some of the things that they might need to do, equipment replacement, or other projects that might be on in the plan. So ours is pretty simple compared to the campuses because we don't have nearly the divisions or departments.
Great, thanks, Fred. Thank you, everybody. So this is sort of the last big slide I've got. It's how you can stay connected with the budget process. There are various ways to do so. You can see information on the budget allocation handbook on our website. CBF and DCC also have open meetings, and you can also talk to your representatives on each of those groups. The campus planning and budget committees, all the different PBs and Cs that you heard are also available for your participation, as well as the information at the Board of Trustees meetings. And we are always available to discuss any information we present for budget. If the different groups would like us to do a presentation, we're also available to do that. And the Chancellor's Office has budget news on their website. And also the CBF and DCC websites do have information from their meetings. I know that many of you have questions on how to look at your own budgets, and each campus does provide support from its budget office for you. I will also be doing some open Q&A sessions, and I'll be sending out some information as these get set. So that's going to be something we're going to be trying to do to see if it helps people get more information. But for those of you who are here, thank you for participating, but we do have a question for you all. In an attempt to sort of get our information out, we really appreciate your sharing this information out as well and having us share the information. I'd like to offer you all the opportunity to weigh in on whether we should have a part 2 of this forum. Let me see, Leslie, should I start the poll? You want to start the poll? I have a poll for you. I don't know where it is. Okay, perfect. So the question is, should we do a part 2 of this forum separately that looks at the 23-24 preliminary RAM, the budget and the information that was used to develop that information? Is that something that you'd like to have? And if so, say yes. If you don't care or you don't want to do it, say no, and we'll take that information and see if we should try to put together something. I think a lot of people have questions about the upcoming resource allocation model. We know we're seeing a structural deficit, and I think people are, interested in what that means for them. So take a look at that when you get a chance. And I think that's kind of the end of our resource allocation model, unless there's some few moments for any Q&A that we might have that we might want to do live. But if not, we can go ahead and just sort of wind down, answer your questions, and then log off and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Cashew, I do have a comment. While we have the poll to do additional, maybe an additional forum to answer questions, I would invite everyone to either CBF or DCC. We meet just about every month, but we do go over those details in terms of the assumptions that we're using to build the budget. If you don't want to actually attend the meeting, the information is on the district's website for CBF and DCC, but we do try to get into the detail where all the numbers come from. In addition, we try to share the information for all the categorical programs. We share the compendium that comes from the State Chancellor's Office. So you can get the same information that we all receive as budget officers from the State Chancellor's Office. So if you wanted to look what our district receives or what the other 71 community colleges receive, you can get all the detail in the compendium. You can also go to the Chancellor's Office website to get what the numbers are, the actual numbers in terms of our apportionment report. So we try to be very transparent in getting that information out if you're interested. While we can do a separate forum, it's really a lot of the same information can be picked up either attending CBF or DCC. Those are open meetings and anybody can attend those. So that's what I would add. Cashew?
I think that's about it, Fred. Thank you all very much. Unless Stephen or Terry has a closing comment, I think we can be right on the mark and call it done.
We did get one question in the ask a question. I did try to respond to that. You kind of covered it a little bit later into the presentation, but Kyle, I hope that answered your question.
And Naveen, you had your hand up, but if you want to put that question in the Q&A instead of raising your hand, we haven't enabled the chat or the participant microphones. So put the question in and we'll try to get to it, I think. All right, so thank you all very much for joining us. Feel free to reach out to me or any of our budget people with additional questions to follow up, and keep an eye out for any of those other sessions and things that we do at the campus level, at the district level, to help you navigate the budget information, which is complex and difficult. All right, bye everybody.
Bye, everyone.
See some of you at the board meeting.
Naveen, you're still online. If you'd like to put your question into the Q&A, we could take a look at it and get back to you.